we should recognize that we are not merely a conglomerate of bones, flesh, and blood, as Christ said, "Ye see me have." In other words, henceforth know we no man any more after the flesh. Most of us, through familiarity with the orb of vision, will always develop a response to the stimuli of vision. If we see someone approaching us, we recognize them by our sight. But what is it that we see of the individual? What we see is merely the same thing that we see in everyone that we meet, except we identify a different pattern. In other words, we recognize a different person. But the real person is seldom perceived through the ordinary vision. Henceforth know we no man any more after the flesh. So what is it then that we really probably are perceiving in a human being when they approach us, if we have the spiritual eyes to discern? It is the inner structure of man. But underneath this inner structure of man individualized is God. And if we look at God in a man named John Jones, or we see God in someone called Shelley Jones, it doesn't make any difference, do you see? Because God is the same in everyone. But what is it then that we see are structured within man? It is the use of thought. Two thoughts are manifest. The first thought is the thought of God. And this, in effect, is God individualized, per se. But we are not concerned with this because God is the same in all. What we are concerned with recognizing as individuality, this is the structure of man's use of thought. God's use of thought produces the spirit of the universal in all. And it is the true common denominator whereby we may see a similarity in us all. The differences that are compounded through the use of thought. Thought is ours, as it is God's. In other words, if we have the components to produce fire, we have the flint, and we have a stack of straw. What is it that ignites the straw but the spark from the flint as we strike it? This produces a flame, and the flame consumes the straw. St. Paul said many, many centuries ago on Mars Hill, "Ye men of Athens," he said, "I beheld here an altar to the unknown God, whom ye therefore ignorantly worship. Him declare I unto you. God that made the heavens and the earth," he went on. And then he spoke of that God, as some of the poets had said in that time, "Ye are his offspring." In other words, him declare I unto you. And he went on to say, "God that made the heavens and the earth dwelleth not in temples made with hands." So that the structures that house God in reality are the things that are made without human agency. Yet, in effect, we are all architects. You are an architect, and you are drawing a blueprint, whether it is the haphazard creation of a child playing upon the rug with blocks, or whether it is a mature individual creating a blueprint for a city, a traffic pattern by which people will find it easy to move about, or mapping out areas of the brain where dangers or infection lurk that must be expurgated by the scalpel of the surgeon. All things that we do of a material nature, all things that we do of a spiritual nature, and even the idling of the mind, all things are the result of correct thought or incorrect thought or idle thought. Boredom is produced because of a lack of human interest. Why a lack of human interest? Because we have a hypnotic state whereby almost auto-hypnosis is produced, or external communications of psychic energy from those who intend to malign the human race, whereby our minds or brains in their hemispheres become polarized to the state of not thought. In other words, we become bored, we lose interest in the vitality of God. And why is this so? It is because we do not understand the correct use of these two phrases: resist not evil, and resist the devil, and he will flee from you. We must correctly divide the word. We must break the bread of life. We must recognize that if we take our energy, our thought energy, and we constantly maintain a state of on guard, in other words, we are always on the qui-vive, we're always standing defensively with sword in hand, ready to thrust. If our energies are totally engaged in the defensive maneuver, we probably are losing out a great deal on life. Because correct thought requires the relaxed state also, the state of peace. Hence, both statements are absolutely correct. There are times when we must be on the defensive. We must resist evil. There are times when it is best not to engage our energies in even recognizing evil, but stress the absolute indomitable power of recognizing the all power of God, the power of goodness that created the original, the pure, the pristine pattern of life, not only for this planet, but for the universe. Somehow or other, man has a tendency, of course, to identify with his home, with his locale, with his wife, with his family, with his friends. We become identified with centers of being, the centers of other people's being, their life. And we think that because we incorporate individuals into our life, that we are identifying in a stronger way with life. I remember something my mother told me, and I remember something that various aged people have told me, that they had come to the place where all of their school chums, those they went to school with in the elementary school, all of the people that occupied their hometown that they knew, in fact, all of their friends had passed on, and they sat alone. And now they did not have the self-same interest that they formerly had in living, because their associates were gone, and somehow or other the acceptance of their own passing, which they had resisted before, now was possible to them, and they sat and waited to die. This shows then how we have a tendency not to identify with the universe, with the ongoingness of generations, but rather to identify with those that we hold near and dear. I am not advocating that we should turn against those that we love, no. But I am advocating a sense of identification with the ongoingness, hopefully, of the world, and the thought, the positive thought that we must send out into space as a means of hallowing space in order to create in our world the great tender realities that God has already placed within us. For we are alchemists, one and all. It is up to us to evoke responses from the world. Today, most people are victims of reaction. The action of others affects us, and we identify with what people do to us. We must become prime movers of destiny, not just the moved. For we are not the checkers or the chessmen upon the board. Instead, we are the movers, if we will take dominion over the earth. The masses of people today are like sheep going up the gateways to the slaughterhouses. They are victims of mass movements, of mass thinking, and they do not have the alchemical freedom which the masters intend those who are truly free to have, to be, and to manifest. Thoughts are, and the structure of our thoughts affects us more than we can know. For example, let us take an individual who finally grows weak and discouraged fighting the world's thought about him or her. I want to bring this out because it is a very important part of your future life if you will let it be. Did you know, for example, and I experienced this for myself, many years ago I worked for a man whose name was right and he was never wrong. And so I really never had a great deal of fear of people, nor did I fear circumstances. And so one day a matter came up that it was necessary for me to go to his office. And I went into his office, and for the first time in my life, I was amazed to find myself stuttering. Yes, Mr. Wright, I was stuttering. Imperfection was manifesting in my world. Where did it come from? At that time, at first, I was more or less oblivious of where it came from. How could this be that I, to whom my mother always said had the gift of gab, could now find myself speechless before this man? And he had a little mustache, and he was very suave and very distinguished, Mr. Wright. And there I sat, shivering in my chair and wishing that I could sink down through the floor. Why? Well, I found out. And the reason was Mr. Wright's thought of me, and Mr. Wright could not be wrong. I was accepting the overcoat, the pateen, the garments of his thought. And I noticed, time after time, whenever I entered his office, I had the same experience, until I learned to overthrow, to dethrone, to kick out Mr. Wright's wrong thought of me. Because the world has what we may call an inadvertent hypnotic effect on each other, and they learn how to do it. Yesterday morning, when I was making a television film for one of the local stations, the gentleman who was interviewing me said that he was able to guide the conversation by the hypnotism of his thought. No, he may do it with some people. He did not do it with us. And I'm not boasting of this. It is simply that God has said that we should take dominion over our own world, not over the world of others. I do not think it would be proper, nor do I think it would have been proper had I elected to try to dominate Mr. Wright, even if Mr. Wright was wrong. It was up to me to dominate the image of myself, to assert by thought the kind of a person I wanted to be a follower of God, yes, but not God as an insipid, antiseptic image of an old man in some section of the universe, whose long white beard, painted by a long passed away Leonardo da Vinci, should somehow or other create an image of God as though God were feeble and helpless, when in reality God was all beauty, all life, all wonder, all joy, all reality, and the avant-garde, transcendent manifestation of the selfhood of every person, not just myself. What a wonderful thing then it is to be able to obey the injunctions of Jesus Christ and to recognize that we have a responsibility at times to resist the form of evil that comes to us in order to enthrone in us someone else's image of what we are, rather than God's image of what we are. Now, it does not yet appear, the Masters tell us, what we shall be. But it goes on to say, when he shall appear, when we shall see him as he is, we shall be like him. And so it is essential that we recognize our own limitations about God, that we realize that we are affected by our limitations of God. Our ideas of God may be immature, infantile, prattling. I'm not saying that yours is. I said ours may be. The point is, we have to be capable of growing up spiritually, of maturing, of being able to hold lofty concepts of God and recognize that we may transcend or rise above those concepts of yesterday to understand that God, that is a spirit, has provided a vehicle through which we may express, and that of more importance even than the physical vehicle, the part of man that can exercise and demonstrate physical mastery, is the mind of man that is identifiable with the mind of God, that can state with the Christ, all power in heaven and earth is given unto me, and I will give it to whomsoever I will, and to recognize that the will and the motives of the will are paramount and of great import in our establishing a force field of what we determine is the will of God around ourselves. Holding an openness in spirit of asking God to help us in our own envisionment of what thoughts we wish to share with him. Getting back then to the thoughts of God, it is important that we understand in a deeper way the nature of God and the ability of God to let us mature, to let us grow up in Christ. Many people have felt that Christ was only the man who lived as Jesus 2,000 years ago, without understanding the joint heirship that is possible to all of us. As a small boy, I used to ponder on this. I wondered many times, why did God create, according to the patterns that orthodoxy brings to us, why did he create one man and make him the doorway to all life? Later on, of course, and I'm sure many of you have understood this, the universal Christ appeared. I was able to see that God had one image in which he created all men, and that image was actually the Christ image. And then I understood the scriptures in John, where it says, all things were made by him, and without him was nothing made that was made. In him was life. And so we recognize the statement, before Abraham was, I am. This takes us back to the latent image of God that is placed within us for photographic development. Do you understand what I'm talking about? A camera, a simple little thing like a camera, in which there is placed film, perceives through its own lens eye system an image. The image is transferred by light to the film, and then if you carried that camera 1,000 years before developing it, when it was developed, that camera print would be the image that was taken 1,000 years ago, or two, or more. So we have to understand that when man was created in God's image, it was the placing upon the film of consciousness of a latent image. And the development of that image belongs to us. And that development is an ageless process. And it is not necessarily one in which the first are assured of being the last. For Jesus said, many that are first shall be last, and the last first, indicating that physical time is not necessarily the guarantee or assurance that we may have that we are going to develop that image first. So what is it that really counts? It is the determination and the motivation of our hearts, which indicates our whole intent to be all that God intends us to be. Our thought must become congruent with God's thought. The triad of the Holy Spirit, of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, must become congruent with our body, our mind, and our soul, and our whole being. We have to let the wholeness of ourselves become the allness of God. And this is really a process. It is a process whereby Christhood is attained. It is naturally attained as a product that can be truly stamped, made in heaven. Yet this product evolves from the plane of this earth where we find ourselves. So thoughts are, and in reality, all of the people that we meet are products of their thoughts. I want to touch then briefly upon what we call the idling of the mind, which can be used as an interval to create and to take dominion over the earth also, when what precedes it is a directive from the conscious motive and will of the individual. If you determine that a thing shall be so, and you let that saying, as Christ said, sink down into your ears, which means enter your whole heart, permeate your body, your mind, and your soul, it is absolutely possible that that thought can be in manifestation in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. I will cite an example for you that I think you deserve to hear. Several years ago, in the state of Virginia, I was quite high up on a ladder, just about dinner time. The rung broke, and I found myself hurled with almost the speed of an automobile to the ground below, where my body hit the ground with such force that my heart lost its rhythm. Not only did my heart lose its rhythm, but I felt the gush of warm blood flooding all over internal organs. And I knew within myself that I was intended to die from that fall. I said one thing. I said, Lord Christ, I know I have really seriously injured myself, or so my senses report. There is not time, and I know it, in order to plead with you, for I know that you want me whole. I said, I demand in the name of Almighty God that every electron, every cell, every part of my being shall be made whole this instant, and I demand that it remain so, and that I suffer no effects from this fall. In the meantime, my heart was finally gasping for its last breath, you might say. But I kept on, and I affirmed absolutely the perfection of God Within 3 minutes, I was on my feet. I walked in the house. I sat down at the table. I ate my evening meal. I said practically nothing. And I want to tell you today that I have never suffered any ill effects from that. Neither was I sore, nor did I have any bad effects in my system. I maintained the perfect health of the Christ consciousness through the motivation, intent, and determination to do so. Do not then sell yourself short, or sell short the capacities and potentials that lie within you. You have, by the power of the divine thought, a most magnificent power that really is greater than all the physicians of the world. You have the good physician, and quite naturally, if you obey his laws, if you affirm his perfection by the actions you do every day, and I'm sure we all, when we get out sometimes in hotels, motels, and things that you run into along the road that masquerade as bistries, places you can eat, I'm sure that we all have created indiscretions, as I have too, and I admit it, but not through free will, but through circumstances. And so, if we will try to eat right, to think right, to live right, and to be right, it will work, and we will manifest the kingdom of heaven within ourselves. Now, I started to tell you something about the idling of the mind, which you have heard of before. It is this: the idle mind is supposed to be the devil's workshop. I have never quite been able to figure out why it isn't God's. But I rather think that the reason this is so is because God is busy always thinking. Remember, Jesus made a very interesting statement. He said, "The Father worketh hitherto, and I work." So, somehow or other, whereas the concept of the meditator, the man sitting in Padmansa, in the lotus posture, the man just thinking about God or meditating upon him, comes to mind in many cases as being the supreme. I think that in reality, even though the meditative posture not be assumed, that man can, if he wills it so, and I say if he wills it so, he can enter into the great powerhouse of God's consciousness without necessarily looking like someone that is meditating. I remember several years ago being in the home of an East Indian from India who was a disciple of a great guru, and we were getting ready to have some chapatis. And there was a young lady there, a rather tall young lady, who had really participated in all of the aspects of yoga. And I'm not picking on yoga, but I'm just stating this fact because it was so humorous. And somehow or other, this young lady, who was quite tall and stately, she decided that it was very important, as many students do, that they be noticed by others. And they become self-conscious in assuming any form of meditation, whether it just be to sit in front of other people. And so, just like in one of the ashrams that I attended many years ago, I was sitting there meditating in this ashram, and I happened to open my eyes, and lo and behold, all the very advanced spiritual people, very advanced, they were looking at me. And so I was aware of the fact that they weren't watching God, they were looking at me. And so this woman was very, very self-conscious, and lo and behold, as we looked at her, she had a case of fluttering eyelids. And unless you were to see this for yourself, you cannot imagine it. Because whereas you might see someone winking at you at this speed, she was going about 10 times that fast, and both eyelids were flickering up and down. And it was very difficult for me to keep a straight face, as I imagine you'd have had the same trouble as I did. But many times people become involved in externals, you see. And so an idle mind can be the devil's workshop. And sometimes, whereas people imagine that the mind in meditation should be a complete blank, that they should just stop thinking and sit there and then open the door. Open the door, Richard. because you just don't know what's coming in when you do that. And people become victims of all kinds of thoughts. And the reason for that is that many people do not understand the flight of the bumblebee. I'm going to tell you what I mean. In other words, they don't understand that half the world is sleeping most of the time, you see. And there's a great deal of people in different parts of the world who are sleeping the sleep which we call the drugged sleep. In other words, their consciousness becomes a vehicle through which mass entities. Do you remember when Jesus came upon the disciples, the time he came and he found there was a boy there possessed with a demon? And so the disciples were trying their best, to exorcise the demon. It almost reminded us of the sorcerer's apprentice. They were trying to really get rid of this demon, and the demon wouldn't go. So Jesus looked at them and cast the demon right out. And then they said, "How did you do it?" And he said, "Well, this kind goeth out only by prayer and fasting." And we have to understand that only in this way, by what we will call obsession, can people actually let into their world not only the 7 bad demons that were in there before and then cast out, but they can let in sometimes 70 times 7. In other words, they just become filled with mass entities. I'm not boasting now in what I say, but of course, by God's grace, I have the power to see entities, and I can see them on people. And I remember one time of going into a certain psychic's home, and this psychic had probably around 500 entities in the rooms in which, and he was a doctor, and he was a chiropractic doctor. Now, I use lots of chiropractic and recommend it. It's a fine thing. But this individual was a little different. And I looked at the wall, and it reminded me of people having the heads of deer and fish on the wall, because the whole room was just filled with around 500 entities, and they were mounted on the wall like you see the deer heads and fish on the wall. Now, I don't mean that he actually had physical things there, but these were living entities that were almost in the dead state in a way. They were hanging there like barnacles on a ship. And you can imagine the level of the vampirism that was in those entities. Well, the entities, you see, would have sapped the energy of the people. In other words, people would come in there to feel better, take a treatment, then the entities would turn around and vampirize them as they were going out the door, and they'd go out, and their latter state would be worse than their former. And of course, these things exist all the time. People go on to an aeroplane. They take a seat, and they don't seem to recognize that the type of person that sat there before may determine their comfort for the entire flight. And the same is true of a bus or a car. This is one of the reasons why we maintain a Greyhound bus that is fitted out with our own beds, and all the facilities that we need are all right there. We can eat, cook, and sleep 12 people there and travel all over the country. The gasoline tank holds enough gas to take you 700 miles. And then you can refill. So you see, you can travel a major portion of the day without ever filling up with gas. You have the air conditioning, the telephone, the sewer, the electric lights, our own power plant, and all of these things. And why do we do it? We don't do it for luxury. Oh, no. It's a matter of not having to sleep in beds in which other people have slept on the night before and for all the nights before that since the time the hotel was built. It's a matter of being able to stay in our own vibratory action. And I certainly recommend it if it's possible for everybody. It's a good system. Now, if you can't do it, what do? Well, you certainly use that power of right thought. And you use the power of right thought in order to be able to create an environment that you want to feel comfortable in. And this is a right thing. You should not just sit there and allow the leeches of the vibrations of someone else to sap your energy and arrive in a state of despair almost where you're going. Instead of that, you should exercise dominion over your world. Do you see the point? It's a very important point, and it's practical, and it works, and we've tried it again and again. Now sometimes, because of our deep dish sensitivity, you know what a deep dish telescope is? These are the kind of telescopes that look at the stars like you saw in those pictures this morning. The deep dish telescopes are able to get radio signals from far off stars and bring it down here where it can be amplified and they can get a picture of what's going on. This requires great sensitivity. Both Elizabeth and I are highly sensitized individuals, and it is possible that if people sleep in the room where we are, that entities can come through them because they're sleeping. That's why I advocate that we don't have anybody sleeping in here. You understand, it's really quite a problem. We have to keep people awake. I remember one time I was in Los Angeles, and I was in a desperate situation because there was a woman that had a lot of psychic energy that was the wrong kind of energy, and so she parked right in the front row, and she insisted in the front row, mind you. I could have understood it if it was up in the balcony, but in the front row, and she had to go to sleep. So I finally, in desperation, seized the American flag, and I went over there and I pounded her on the toes with it and woke her up. And she looked at me, she says, "What's happening?" And I said, "Well," I said, "you can't sleep in my meeting." I said, "If you want to sleep," I said, "you're going to have to go home and go to bed." So I brought the flag back, and she says, "Well, I've been sick." And I said, "Well," I said, "maybe you should be at home and be in bed then." But I said, "I don't want you to sleep, because what happens, because of my sensitivity, a lot of times an entity can come in, I don't say every time, but it can come in through a person's consciousness, and then because this living human being is acting as a focus for that entity in the very room, this may very well break up my ability to minister to the people that come to hear me. Because I'm very dependent on attunement with my God presence, but so are you. And this is where a lot of people don't realize how much their happiness depends upon their contact with God. You know, there's an old saying, it goes like this. It says, "If diving into the sea in search of a pearl, you don't find a pearl, the fault lies not in the sea, but in thee." And so if we would stop to realize that much of our happiness and our enjoyment of life and our advancement and our progress depends upon our receptivity rather than just the speaker, we would understand not only generation but regeneration. We would understand that we have a right to tune in with our divine presence so that we can appreciate what's being done. In other words, if I tune in with God and I bring God down into my consciousness and God synthesizes and spins out the cocoon of words, those words would not, even if they were charged with the keys of hell and of death, if they give you the victory over hell and death, unless you use those keys, they will not work. You can carry them around as an ornament. You can pin them on your dress or on your suit or put them in your pocket, but this will not help. The correct use of the keys to the kingdom are what really counts. I am absolutely convinced that the Masters have again and again given us in the pearls of wisdom keys to our spiritual identity. I'm convinced that the book, for example, contains thousands and thousands of keys. I am convinced by the fact that I have seen individuals ascend through the teachings of the Masters in the Summit Lighthouse, and I'm sure in probably many other organizations. I don't specifically know of them, but I do know that it has worked through our organization. Not through the physical organization, but through obedience to the precepts of the Masters, the obedience to God. So if those keys are there and they work, it is up to us as individuals to become a little bit more determinate in correcting our world. Several years ago, I was fortunate enough to hear Dr. Kenneth McFarland, who was then the educational consultant for General Motors. The man talked for 4 hours without stopping. And when he was through at the end of 4 hours, the audience was begging for more. So I was convinced at that time, and I still am convinced, that it is possible to spark and inspire a group of people and literally, in many cases, to make it possible for them to toast their shins on your fires. Now, I don't find anything wrong with that, providing individuals can come to the realization of the fact that they have the same stimulus within themselves, and then if you can inspire them to start using it, because then the greatest joy comes. If it comes as a result of inspiration from the outside to the inside, this is fine. But it cannot always be guaranteed to happen, because we do not always sit on the coattails of someone that is capable of this, providing this stimuli. So what is more important then? The ability to just listen, or the ability to be able to generate and regenerate within ourselves? I think it is the ability to kindle thought. In other words, to kindle the divine thought in ourselves. And by the bursting forth of this thought, to begin to realize what and who we are. And when we do, when we begin to generate this thought and to regenerate it in people, it is not too long a time before the whole atmosphere of the room becomes vibrant. It becomes vital. It becomes an outreach of God to man, and even to the city, to the walls of the community. There is an extension of the divine ray of man's right thought about himself. Thought is a powerful activity. Let's see just how powerful. Let us now begin the process of examining how the warp and the woof of creation was interwoven by divine thought. Now, we can do it through, of course, inductive reasoning, and through deductive reasoning, or through syllogistic reasoning. We can go all the different routes. But what we want to do in this case, I think, is start from the physical evidences that are apparent to our eyes, and then move inward until we see how the life waves of God's thought are really the substance or the energy by which all things are compounded or composed. Now here we are. We have a living organism, our own body, and I think it's probably best that we start with our own physical body. You have a beating heart, and your heart is beating with God's energy right now. The drums of life are moving and flowing, and because they move and flow, you have consciousness. You would not have consciousness if it were not for the diastole and systole of the heart, for the ebb and the flow of the tides, for the dark and the daylight. In other words, for the negative and positive energies, the yin and the yang. You would not have this unless the law was out working in your being. In this case, it is the law of abundant life. And so your heart is beating. But like all parts of your body, the brain, the bone, the hands, all substance, the heart is composed of cells, little tiny cells. Some years ago, Life magazine had photographed one of these cells and blew it up to a huge page. And we were able to see what looked like a miniature city, almost a Buckminster Fuller creation, a geodetic dome, as it were. And vast enterprises were going on, physical enterprises, within the city of the cell. And so we see that the cell itself is quite complex. The cell is actually like the brick of which a building is composed. But you all know that the grains of sand compose the brick, and many other things, including the substance of the mortar. So the cells exist, and in effect they are working side by side with all of the other cells of the heart. But if you actually go below the cellular level into what we call the atomic structure, you are going to find, as all of our young people know and most of the older people know, the cells are composed of the atom. Of course, because we can't see a physical atom, we have a tendency to more or less disregard all of its implications. But in reality, the scientific laws and the laws of nature put it all together, and it works. And because it works, it is important to us. It may not be necessary that we understand how it works in order to have it work, of course, but it does probably help our native curiosity. We would like to know how things work. So we come to the point of the atomic structure, and there, of course, we have the electrons within the atom, and we have the center of the electron with all of the revolving forces, you see, that are revolving around it. And then finally, if we keep going down, it's almost like that little girl. Did you ever see the pictures that used to appear back in the 1800s? And I imagine some of you have these picture books in your attic, where a little girl is standing there holding a mirror, and she has beautiful hair. It's very long, and she's holding this mirror in her hand. And you look into the mirror, and what do you see? But you see the little girl. And you see she's holding another mirror in her hand. And then that mirror is holding another little girl and another mirror. It's the same girl. And this goes back into infinity. Well, you come to a point where after a while it seems there is no basis for going any deeper. So what then, when you come to what seems to be the ultimate little amount of substance that you can identify, what is it that actually controls life? It is what is called by our scientists mind stuff. Now think of that and see how thought is the basis of creation. But whose thought? We read that God is a spirit. And so somehow or other, as Shakespeare wrote, this cloud-capped domain, all these spires could pass away and vanish into thin air. And we have to recognize that if God withdrew the support of God's thought from the physicality of the world and the universe, that the whole universe would then vanish away, even though we might be right here, because we would vanish away with it from a physical standpoint. Yet, because we are a part of God, we would not really disappear, but we would be right where God is, and we could say, "Where thou art, I am." So that being and beingness are very vital parts of our being, because through being and beingness we attain immortality. And this is the immortality of God. In effect, man's existence in God is not dependent on his goodness or his evil, on his achievement or his not achievement, upon whether he manifests dark or light. I want you to understand this. It is not dependent on that. But I'm talking about God's awareness of man without man's awareness of God. In other words, you could be sleeping and still be a part of the universe. Do you understand this? In other words, you're sound asleep, and whether you're sound asleep or dead, it doesn't make any difference while you're sound asleep or dead, because you will still be a part of God. And the sinner as well as the saint has this, because all things came forth through Christ and came forth from God or from spirit into the womb of matter, including our bodies, our science, our human logic as well as our divine logic. But what is it then that is so vitally important? It is our self-awareness, our awareness of the fact that we are. In other words, God may be aware that we are, in whatever form that may be. But we need to be aware of life. And through our awareness, we will find a divine unity manifesting in our life. This is the required synthesis that we all must achieve. Christ had this. He looked up, he raised his hands, and he said, "Father, I thank thee." And it passed through the untrammeled universe. I mean, it absolutely wiped out impediment. The very thought, "Father, I thank thee," it penetrated through substance. Do you see how powerful thought is? Thoughts are. God bless you.